Hi, everybody. Thank y'all for joining us today. I'm Katie Doris. I'm the Communications and Outreach Manager for the Georgia-Alabama Land Trust. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Land Trust, we are a nonprofit land conservation organization that protects land across the Southeast, primarily in Georgia and Alabama. But we've recently just hit a milestone of 500,000 acres protected, so we're really excited to share that news. And if you want to learn more about the organization or stay up to date on our work, you can check out our website or follow us on social media, and I'll drop those links in the chat. I wanted to say a quick thank you to our corporate sponsors who help make our work possible. These include Rayonier, PNC Bank, Thornhill Capital Management, and Georgia Power. I also want to say thank you to our speakers for sharing their time and expertise with us today. We have Eddie White, who is the lead forester for the Georgia-Alabama Land Trust, and Drew Metzler, who is the Forest Health Coordinator with the Alabama Forestry Commission. A few housekeeping things before we get started. There will be time at the end for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A as we go, or at the end, if you would like to ask your question out loud, you can click request to speak and I can give you access. Also, it will be recorded today, and so you can find the recording on our YouTube, and I'll also send out an email to everyone who registered with the link. But yeah, with that, I will turn it over to Eddie White and we can get started.
Hey Katie, can everyone see my screen?
We can, and we can hear you.
Awesome. I'm Eddie White, and again, I'm the lead forester at the Georgia-Alabama Land Trust. I want to thank all of y'all for taking some time to join us here today. So we're going to do a update on southern pine beetles across their native range, pretty much Alabama and Georgia in the southeast, and kind of give everyone a status quo update.
Oh, Eddie, you're muted.
Can y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfect.
We
Okay.
didn't hear anything you said though. So once we got to this slide, at least.
Okay. So I'll restart. So the southern pine beetle is a native forest pest. You can see a picture of it over here. They're approximately about the size of a grain of rice, about 2 to 4 millimeters in length. They're reddish to brown black in color, and they attack in dense clusters on the low to mid stories of pine trees. So it's going to be pretty hard to physically see one of these little beetles flying through the woods. So the southern pine beetle range basically correlates with all of your southern yellow pine tree species that you can see here. They've been known to attack any form of southern yellow pine, loblolly slash, longleaf, shortleaf, and pitch pines. They commonly attack in mature overstock stands of pine, and typically their highest attack prevalence can be found in stands of loblolly pine plantation. So the biggest telltales of an attack forming on your property or neighbor's property, from an aerial view, you're going to see expanding rings of dead pine trees. This is especially prevalent if you get a wintertime image where you know that all of the hardwood obviously has leaf off. And if you see what you know to be pine trees, which obviously hold needles throughout the winter, and you see expanding circles of death, that means you probably have a problem. On the ground, you're going to see pitch tubes like this coming out of pine trees. This is where the tree's natural defenses is trying to push the beetle out, because that's actually sap. Once the tree pushes it out, it dries into these tubes. Under the bark, if you peel it off of an attacked tree, you're going to see these S-shaped galleries under the bark, and that's also a telltale of beetles. So like I said, pitch tubes, this is a good close-up of it, is the tree's natural response trying to push a beetle out. And you can see right up here where it's kind of pushed one out. And you're also going to see this frass down below, or like super fine pine tree shavings. A lot of times you can see this if it's super fresh on spider webs and things like that. that may be on the ground around it. And that's how you know it's fresh frass like this is a very fresh current attack going on. There's going to be a lot of heavy sap flow. So when a tree is attacked, you're going to know it. There's not going to be a lot of question about it. And like I said, boring dust or frass down here is what you're going to see as well. So pine beetles expand their attacks in a circular formation. So the center of the attack is where you're going to have your most noticeable mortality, and they're going to typically expand out in a directional front. So as you go farther and farther away from the actual epicenter, you're going to see dead trees, trees that are midway through dying. They might have half their foliage starting to turn brown, and then on the outer edge, you're going to see foliage that's not that dark, rich green and starting to turn yellow and a few red needles. So that's how you kind of track the direction of it. And after I finish my slides, Drew will explain more about the annual monitoring that the state does to help landowners with these outbreaks. So really, the beetles have a two-pronged attack. They bore into the tree, and the boring process alone under heavy attacks can effectively girdle a tree. But they're also co-carriers of what we commonly call the blue stain fungus. And this fungus cohabitates and it actually creates food for the beetles, the larval to feed off of. But once this fungus grows, it'll clog the metabolic pathways in the tree, and that too will effectively kill the tree. So there's not really much saving you can do of a pine tree once it's been heavily attacked. If it can force the beetles out, it might survive, but odds are that tree is probably going to succumb to the infestation. The best thing you can do is to maintain your forest in a healthy and vigorous state, keeping especially your pine trees at appropriate stocking levels. Stressed trees that are not the healthiest attract pine beetles more than stands of timber that are healthy. So a proactive approach versus reactive is going to be your best bet to keeping a healthy forest. And even that being said, I've seen plenty of healthy stands last summer that were being properly managed were still attacked and suffered some severe mortality. A big thing you can do from the get-go if you're harvesting timber in the near future and reestablishing is manage your property with site-appropriate tree species. Pine tree species that are planted off-site are not best for that soil and weather conditions, will struggle to grow, and they won't be as healthy as other species will be. So you're kind of putting yourself behind the eight ball if you plant off-site. So like I said, you want to maintain a healthy forest. You want to keep your pine timber thinned on a regular basis to keep its health and vigor up. You want to conduct regular checks of your property, or if you're some people are absentee landowners, you're not out there all the time. Maybe your hunt club or you have a consulting forester or someone like that, but you need to be periodically checking on your property to make sure that you don't have any major forest health issues going on, because catching them early can be a big difference between having a massive salvage operation or a small harvest to solve the problem. And I always say where site conditions are appropriate, of the southern yellow pines tree species, longleaf pine tends to be the most resistant to pine beetle attacks. So once a pine beetle infestation gets into your stand, really your only option is to go in and have a sanitation harvest. You need to get ahead of the attacking front, and you have to remove their food source, which is pretty much pine trees. Generally speaking, the rule of thumb is about 2.5 tree lengths away from the last infected tree needs to be harvested as a buffer. Pine beetles can't fly too terribly far without running into another pine tree to continue their expansion. So that's why it's good to catch these things early, because this could turn into be a small clear cut of 10 acres to stop the problem, or if you let it run all summer, you might be looking at a 60 or 70 acre harvest, with the timber in the middle at the epicenter being potentially worthless by the time you get a harvest going. As a pine tree dies, if it dies from pine beetle attack, it can quickly degrade and lose its financial value. I know a lot of landowners and wood dealers across Alabama and Georgia have been struggling to even help their clients sell and get rid of dead and down wood. The mills get so overrun with it, they really don't want it. And a general rule of thumb, once the bark starts slipping off the tree, it's not holding bark. Um, Most of your chip and saw log grade logs will be downgraded to pulpwood at best if you can get them on the truck and they can make it there. Waiting long periods of time, just kind of seeing what's going to happen with a salvage situation or pine beetle episode is not the best move. Um, if a stand is dead and degrades far enough, it will become worthless, and then you're going to have a rather expensive bill trying to clean that up and reforest in the future. So this is an update from the 2024 outbreak across Alabama. This was one of the worst pine beetle seasons we've had in the past 23, 24 years. Georgia as well experienced exceptionally high numbers, um, in the upper millions and millions of dollars of timber lost. And I'm sure Drew will have more recent updated numbers on this as well. So the state does have cost share assistance programs that are out there for landowners to apply for disaster relief from pine beetle kill attacks. Um, if approved, you can get pretty substantial cost to help reforest your property. And Georgia also has rolling cost share assistance programs to assist landowners with pine beetle outbreak attacks as well. So you do have resources out there. You just need to know about them and get involved with the right people to get you help if you're not knowledgeable on how to manage your forest, sell timber, and replant on your own. And right here is my contact information. I'm always available to assist landowners in Alabama and Georgia. I'm located in Opelika, Alabama currently, and I'm happy to talk with anyone out there who needs some assistance in the future.
Thank you, Eddie. Oh, Drew, you're muted. There we go.
All right. You want me to go ahead and move forward?
Yes, please.
All righty. Just a quick check to make sure you're seeing the full screen there.
We are.
All right. Well, anyway, I'm Drew Metzler. Eddie did a great job covering pine beetle biology there and definitely some of the sanitation and control measures. I oversee our forest health monitoring program here with the Alabama Forestry Commission, and it's a role that I started last January. So needless to say, it's been a very active year and a half, well, approaching 2 years now. But we'll go ahead and kind of get started to see where things are at now. So every year, as part of our forest health monitoring efforts, we do a spring pheromone survey. So we try to gauge what southern pine beetle populations are like before we start seeing widespread mortality during the summer months. And this is basically a chart that shows the numbers after a 4-week period of survey collections, where they fall into different risk categories. And fortunately, most of the counties that I surveyed, that the Forestry Commission surveyed, were at least in that moderate or low category. We did have some counties there like Franklin County, which was very hard hit last year, there in the northwest part of the state, and then Tallapoosa County and Shelby County was one of the counties that I surveyed that was very worrisome as far as the numbers go. And included on that chart are national forest numbers from each of the districts here in the state. Fortunately, Bankhead was kind of the epicenter of a lot of the activity last year. Those numbers have since dramatically dropped. However, the main Talladega Ranger District, both Talladega and Shoal Creek, both had incredibly high numbers. So we were definitely expecting a lot of activity in that east central and northeast part of the state. And online, there's a digital model that's available to the public. And this is a model developed by Dartmouth, and it's on spbpredict.org, I do believe. I can't remember if it's .org or .com, but this is something that's readily accessible every year when all the participating states submit their spring survey data. It gets uploaded here, and it's also a prediction model. And unfortunately, many of the Alabama counties there that were surveyed fell into that high risk category, and some of those western Georgia counties as well. And for the most part, this does largely reflect what we're seeing across the region. There are a few counties there that are probably a little overhyped as far as the beetle activity, but it's pretty accurate thus far. And we're here in late summer now, almost early fall. Kind of July and August are big months for doing aerial surveillance for southern pine beetle and other forest pests. We do have two full-time pilots that work here with the Forestry Commission. One of them there is in the far northwest part of the state along the Tennessee River, and we have another pilot there in Baldwin County, there along the coast. And we do utilize one contract pilot from time to time as well. Something though that's been a lot different since I started is satellite imagery has become a really big tool for us as far as doing southern pine beetle monitoring. The imagery is updated pretty often, and that gives us a great tool, especially this year when we've had an incredibly wet summer across most of the state. And it's just difficult to get up and have a pilot fly, 1 or 2 hours from Northwest Alabama or Baldwin County to maybe survey some of these central Alabama counties. So the satellite imagery has kind of really helped fill that void. So it's actually got us way ahead of where we were at last year at this time. And as of yesterday, this is currently what our public interfacing map looks like. If you go to the Alabama Forestry Commission website and find the southern pine beetle map, that's what you'll see. And there's really three big areas of activity there. Really the Tombigbee River drainage, and that upper Cahaba River drainage there in Shelby and Bibb County. And then most of northeast Alabama is very, very active this year. The northwest part of the state made up the bulk of southern pine beetle spots last year. It has since really calmed down a lot. You've just got some residual activity there, but not a lot of activity like there was last year. And as of yesterday, we had 4,132 southern pine beetle spots across 54 Alabama counties identified. And we've actually surveyed way more than 54 counties. We just have multiple counties that no beetle spots were detected, and that's a lot of the southeast Alabama counties. So that is one bright side, is that we do have one region of the state that really has no activity whatsoever. And I did mention before just the persistent kind of rainy conditions that we've had this summer have really hampered getting out there and flying really any given day, just because we do need a cloud ceiling really above 3,000 feet, just because we do have to fly pretty low to the ground relative to other aircraft to be able to pick up these beetle spots. I believe Eddie showed that map there on the left, and that was last year or at the conclusion of last year, and that was over 10,000 beetle spots. And you can see the northwest part of the state was very heavy, as well as east central, and that same Cahaba River drainage area as well. This year, that's calmed down a pretty good bit. However, we have had some expansion. Some counties that were not particularly all that bad last year are pretty bad this year. So, although numbers are down, some of those counties you may notice, like Blount County, Etowah County, Marshall County, Cherokee County. Those are all counties that have actually seen an increase in southern pine beetle activity relative to the last couple of years. This graph depicts just the general trend over the past few years. Really prior to 2014, a lot of our SPB spots were still cataloged. This was prior to our enterprise GIS system before 2014, so things were cataloged a little bit differently then. Really in 2016, we started using that enterprise GIS system, where a lot more monitoring is done electronically. And 2017 was a particularly bad year in South Alabama, but really the past 2 or 3 years have been just exponential growth. But fortunately, so far this year, things are taking a turn for the better over most of the state. So the number that we have so far this year is a 60% decrease from last year. So that is a major plus. At least things are trending in the right direction. So kind of a written comparison here. So between 2017 and 2024, we were averaging or detecting 216 spots per year. Now, we were not surveying every county in the state back then. We were mainly just surveying mainly the counties with national forest in them and some of the surrounding counties. And last year, with the big uptick in spots, it was really important that we try and survey the entire state, and that's what we did. Um, and overall, that was last year's number was a 4,600 plus percent increase in spot activity over the previous 6 year average. And at the time of survey, so most of these spots were cataloged in July. Basically, the number that we came up with at that time was 3.1 million dead trees, but that only accounts for the mortality at that time of survey. So, and as Eddie mentioned earlier, there's a lot of trees that may be infested ahead of those trees that are brown or turning yellow. So in reality, there's a lot more mortality than that. And last year, Northwest Alabama accounted for over half of all the spots in the state. And this year, that's kind of flipped. Northeast has really accounted for most of the spots, and right now they're right at 68%. Overall, this is a 1,820% increase over that previous 6 year average. What we are seeing this year is some of the spots are larger. Some of that's due to just beetle spots that began last year that have just continued moving. But that average trees infested per spot has gone up this year. There's just a good pie graph just to show a breakdown. And Southeast Alabama is just in that 1% there. So there's really been no activity whatsoever down there. The Southwest region, some of the counties there, like Choctaw County and Washington County, down that way, have a little uptick in activity. But overall, it's mainly the Northeast region. So some takeaways here as far as SPB detection goes this year. In the past, we always pretty much relied solely on aircraft detection to get up there and mark beetle spots. And we would have to have a pilot and usually one or two spotters in the aircraft. And this year, just the technology with satellite imagery has really made things a lot easier. So while both of our pilots are out there flying their respective regions, I've been able to kind of take part of the state and make it my responsibility to survey right here from the office. So it's really sped up the process. If we didn't have that technology handy, we'd probably still be another month away from having the state surveyed and having all these spots cataloged. But so far, 73% of spots have actually been marked right here from the desktop here in Montgomery. whereas about a quarter of those have been marked from the aircraft, and about 1% have been detected just from the ground. And some of those counties there on the bottom of the page are the counties that have had increases this year. The majority of the state has seen drastic decreases, but we have had a handful that are having an uptick in SPB activity. And oddly, Talladega County has seen a decrease in number of spots, but it does lead the state in total southern pine beetle spots with 405. I believe St. Clair County is probably behind Talladega. I think we've detected about 350 or so in St. Clair County. But really, those adjacent counties around Talladega are often pretty bad off. Eddie mentioned, being proactive over reactive, and I think going forward, there's definitely going to have to be a lot more thought to lower density pine planting. Some of that is going to be driven by markets. Some areas of the state just don't have the pulpwood markets that they once had. And then we also just have a lot more timber out there in the landscape too, versus 30 years ago. So the markets just in general are not as good for moving pulpwood in particular. Um, a, a lot or tree genetics have come a long way as far as being able to plant at a lower density and still getting that good growth form. Whereas with previous genetics, you pretty much had to plant at that higher rate just to try and culture that good straight tree that didn't have a lot of forks. But a 10 by 10 spacing or an 8 by 12 spacing is definitely going to have to be a consideration in the future. And if we have time here, and I think we do we have 30 more minutes or 15, 20 more minutes? Because I can talk more about Southern Pine Beetle today if we have time.
We have time.
Okay, so I'll try to address some of the other issues that we're seeing across the state as well with our forest. And one of those is brown spot needle blight. This has been where southern pine beetle has not been an issue, or in many cases in the same areas, brown spot needle blight has been a big one. And this is a fungal pathogen that has really cropped up over the past 6 to 7 years or so. That was historically mainly just limited to longleaf pine. But however, this pathogen has either most likely adapted to take advantage of all the loblolly growing stock out there. And we've seen pretty bad issues with it, especially during the springtime when things are mild, very, humid, mild conditions, lots of rain. And most of the time, that type of stand there, which is this particular photo is from Marengo County, so southwest Alabama. That's usually the type of stands that I was seeing severe infections with. Usually our older stands that are at least 25 years old, but in this case, these were stands that were in the 35 to 37 year range. So maybe a little past their maturity. And usually they had a heavy mid-story component to them as well. And that mid-story component, when it's reaching into the bottom of the crown like that, can actually really help move this pathogen up through the needles and infect more of the crown. So that's a big one that we saw and still are seeing this year. I've seen recurrent infections this summer. August was incredibly mild for most of the state. We really didn't have very, very high temperatures like we normally do, and we had pretty adequate rainfall over the state. And this has caused a little bit of a blow up or recurrent infections in some areas.
Hey, Drew.
Yes.
Before we get too far into brown spot needle blight, we have a few questions about southern pine beetle that
Okay. Good
we could
idea.
address quickly. So we have one question. You mentioned flying and aerial imagery to detect beetle infested areas. Do y'all use drones ever to identify those areas and determine size of the area that has been infected?
So we have some of our, we've probably got a dozen to 18 employees in the agency that are drone certified. Or they do have their drone pilot license. And as needed, we will get out there and fly drones to help find a beetle spot, especially if it can't be found from the ground, or maybe if a stand is just really dense and it's not conducive to getting out there and walking to a spot. We will use drones sometimes to help landowners detect beetle spots. And we do try to ground check, just kind of a general rule of thumb. We try to ground check about 10% of all marked spots, just to make sure, southern pine beetle is the causal agent, or if it's Ips beetles or something else that's going on. And sometimes our guys will need those drones to help them find the spot. It has helped a lot with the satellite imagery. That's really helped increase the accuracy of beetle spot marking. Whereas before that, just from an aircraft, we would be marking from an iPad in a moving aircraft. And if you can mark a spot within 100 yards from a moving aircraft, that's actually pretty accurate. But that's where a drone would really come in handy, um, to help find those aircraft detected spots.
Thank you. We had another question that says, is there a website where landowners can report a beetle infestation on their property to allow for more accurate infestation maps?
So we don't have a direct portal, to my knowledge, to report an infestation. Really, I would encourage folks just to go to our main website and go to our directory and look up our county personnel there in the county and try to get them out there. Because we can come out there and mark a spot from the ground just with our cellular device. So I would encourage folks to reach out to their county AFC employee.
Okay, thank you. One more. Are you seeing trees with genetics that allow for higher incident rates of rust are more susceptible to infection?
So a lot of our natural loblolly genetics are more prone to rust diseases, fusiform rust being one of those. There is a needle rust, that actually crops up from time to time. And then also a lot of folks are interested in the genetics, and if certain genetics are more predisposed to things like brown spot needle blight. And I think there is an argument in some cases that genetics do play a role in disease infection or disease resistance. For years we were able to select for loblolly genetics that were resistant to fusiform rust and pitch canker, and grow, have a straighter form and grow faster. So now I think nurseries are going to have to use, some of that same technology to select for trees with brown spot resistance, because there are varieties of loblolly out there that are resistant to needle blight. It's just finding those trees and propagating them.
Specifically, pine beetle infection. They say, as in trees stressed from rust infection, are they more likely to get southern pine beetle?
Okay, so there's no, to my knowledge, any published literature out there that states that, but anecdotally, you would think that yes, a tree that, especially over the last couple of years, our trees have been exposed to drought stress for long durations of time, and then, you know, this past spring, we have a major defoliation event with widespread needle blight, and that is a stressor, and stressors do compound. So there's just anecdotally potential for there to be more issues from bark beetles as well as other forest pests. So it certainly does not help the tree. We can definitely say that for a fact.
And you mentioned earlier that it's calmed down in North Alabama some. What are y'all's ideas on why that might be?
Some of that in some counties there in Northwest Alabama, is simply just because the amount of at-risk stands simply all got killed last year, or the most susceptible stands. It was just such a large scale event last year that southern pine beetle really ran through them stands and pretty much killed everything that could easily be killed. Now, outside of some of those areas, you have natural, abiotic and biotic factors that come into play. As bark beetle populations really rise, there are predatory beetles as well. And, it's kind of a predator prey relationship. Just given time, those predator populations are going to catch up and help suppress those bark beetle populations. So in some areas, that's probably what happened as well. And then, some abiotic conditions, like temperature and weather play a factor as well. Southern pine beetle larvae, at least the early stage larvae, are pretty temperature sensitive. So if you get a string of really hot sunny days, especially if it's, in the triple digits, that can actually cause mortality of the larva of southern pine beetle. So there might have been some instances of that, causing populations to crash. So it's really a multitude of things. You can't really pin it on just one thing.
That makes sense. Thank you. If anyone has any more questions about southern pine beetle, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you click raise hand, I can give you permission to speak.
All right, so I'll finish up real quick on needle blight. So brown spot is nothing, new. It affects a lot of different pine species, especially a lot of brown spot is an especially bad pathogen on pines in other countries. So in some cases, it's actually an invasive disease. Um, but these infections always start as a small lesion and then expand. And as those lesions expand and coalesce, they basically girdle the needle, and that's actually what causes them to turn brown and fall off prematurely. And then as these needles fall off there in the understory, they actually stay infectious. So they still, are spore producing even though they're there on the ground. Um, so that's where, you know, with longleaf pine, that's where prescribed fire is just, immediately very impactful as far as lessening symptoms of needle blight. But prescribed fire in loblolly is more difficult to tackle. But one would think that's another set of research that's yet to come out. But if you're removing this infectious material from the understory, you would think prescribed burning would be very effective at that. That should at least reduce the amount of infectious material there to reinfect those trees. Um, that picture there in the lower left corner is just a pretty good characteristic photo of needle blight. That's how it gets that disease or that name. More pictures of just, kind of what we're seeing. And then the picture there on the right is a great photo of actually two different stands and two different genetics, but relatively similar ages. But you can see the stand on the right has very severe infection, whereas the stand on the left has mild to no infection at all. And that's just different genetics at play there, and maybe, some sort of microclimate conditions. Just kind of an example of disease progression. Early springtime, you have severe infections. Those disease needles fall off, and then by usually May, you're getting a flush of the current year's needle growth. And then in many cases, by June, in most of the stands I'd look at, there'd hardly be any sign at all that there's infection. So as long as it's just like a one-off occurrence, it's not really a big deal. You might have some slowed growth for a year, but when it's happening chronically year after year, this is where the potential for mortality, maybe not directly from needle blight, but some of these other pests, whether it be southern pine beetle or Ips beetles or some other pathogen, may come into play. So every year I get to go to the Southern Forest Health Work Conference, and it's amazing the amount of research that is going in the needle blight. I probably, this is just some notes that I quickly jotted down in the middle of a concurrent session, but it was amazing how much research that Auburn and Georgia are doing on this and screening all these different families of loblolly genetics to find those tree genetics that are resistant. So I think that's coming out there eventually. They're going to have some more concrete answers to the needle blight question. Kind of already mentioned, genetics playing a factor. I think prescribed fire definitely has a silvicultural role here, and as well as thinning. So, some of our just standard best practices for silviculture. In a nursery setting or a yard tree setting, there's fungicide options out there, but just not really large scale forest land answers yet. Not going to get on into the invasive plants due to time here, but Kogan grass is definitely a big issue that's ever expanding here in Alabama. But we do have other invasive insects, or I should say invasive insects, because our bark beetles are native, but we have invasive insects that are playing a role here in the state and cause issues, namely with hardwoods. One of those is the emerald ash borer, and this is one that has been very impactful in Northeast Alabama. A lot of our Northeast Alabama counties now have emerald ash borer documented in them, and this picture here is from Jackson County back in May. So this is an adult emerging ash borer. This was the first, from what I could tell there, they have been present there in Jackson County from some time. It just took a landowner calling to report it and us getting out there to collect specimens to actually confirm it. But these are some of the things to be looking for. Southern pine beetle have, S-shaped galleries. Emerald ash borer kind of make these S-shaped serpentine-like galleries beneath the bark as well. Unlike southern pine beetle, emerald ash borer don't vector any sort of fungi that bring down the xylem tissue of a tree. They physically have to girdle it, and usually that can take several years to do. But I think the potential for mortality to occur quickly is heightened here in Alabama, where our growing seasons are longer. And I shouldn't just say Alabama, but all the southeastern states. But anytime you see ash trees dying from the top down and you see any D-shaped exit holes like that on the right, that's a good telltale calling card of emerald ash borer. And that photo on the right is really what to look for. A crown that's thinning from the top down, and then some root suckering or epicormic shoots along the bole of the tree. And then we need to update this map there on the left, but that black star there in Calhoun County was the site of initial detection here in Alabama. That they have since been detected, I know, in St. Clair County, Talladega County, Shelby County, Madison County, and Jackson County this year. And as this insect moves further south, there's going to be potential for greater impact, especially in a lot of those black belt counties, and then down towards the Mobile Delta area, where ash is a larger component of the forest. Another map there, and I need to have a map as of today in 2025. But this was a tree that I found with emerald ash borer last summer in Shelby County. This was just a random roadside survey that I did just to kind of follow up on that work in Talladega and Calhoun County, just to try and see if this insect was moving south. And it does turn out it does appear to be moving south. And my inclination is that it's moving south along the Coosa River drainage and possibly along the Cahaba River as well. I'm getting some reports potentially there in Jefferson County of some emerald ash borer activity.
Hey, Drew,
Yep.
we have a few questions going back to southern pine beetle.
Okay. Well, that's pretty good timing because that wraps up all the slides
Perfect.
that I have. So we got plenty of time for questions.
Well, perfect. And thank you, Drew. Really appreciate that. We have one question. Would damage by the southern pine beetle have been less on the slower growing loblolly of the past?
Uh, Generally, trees that are slower growing, especially longleaf pine, are typically more resilient. Um, Longleaf in particular, has much greater resin flow than some of our other pines. So, slower growing species like longleaf are going to have more potential to pitch out any invading insect. Um, with loblolly, I don't know that faster growing trees are any more attractive to southern pine beetle. I think it's just really more of a density factor. How dense are those trees? Are they over mature? Really, basal area plays a huge role, especially if southern pine beetle only have to move a few feet between trees, which is the case normally in our overstock stands. They can really move rapidly and grow in population versus a stand that's been thinned and maybe has 20 feet or so between trees. They're just not going to be able to really ramp up and cause a lot of mortality when they've got to move further or fly further.
Thank you. And then we had another one. Is there anything being done to develop a prevention from infestation or a product to kill the beetles?
Not to my knowledge. Really, to develop trees that are resistant or have the potential to kill beetles, that's where we're really genetically modifying things comes into play, with like gene silencing or something like that. As far as I know, that's not in the cards as far as pine genetics go. Um, Really continuing to harp on those proactive measures, just because a lot of landowners right now, and Eddie, commented on this very well, with markets being very tight. Um, for landowners that were proactive in years past and were able to get a thinning done, usually most of the time they don't have issues. But when you're trying to be reactive now, and when we've got counties that have hundreds of beetle spots in them, it's really difficult to move that wood because a lot of those mills are probably going to be at their quota, and it's just difficult to get a buyer in there, get a logger moved in on that wood in a timely manner to salvage those trees. So the more we can be proactive, the better. And I know the Georgia Forestry Commission just opened up applications for their Southern Pine Beetle Prevention Program. So for landowners there in Georgia, that's something to definitely look into. Alabama had a big sign up for the same program back in 2023. If things go according to plan, we'll probably do another sign up next year. And that's where we do incentivize practices like commercial thinning. So not only do you have the potential to make revenue from a thinning, you get that incentive payment on top of it. And we also cost share low density loblolly planting, like I was mentioning before, where you're planning on like a 10 by 10 spacing, um, as well as prescribed burning. And in the past, we have cost shared longleaf pine planting too, um, which all of those techniques are ways to mitigate southern pine beetle risk.
Thank you. We had one about the emerald ash borer. It says, we have lost trees to emerald ash borers as they suspect here in Calhoun, Talladega County, um,
Mhm.
along Choccolocco Creek. Any advice on preventing further damage?
So trees that have already been infested, there's really nothing that you can do. If there are any residual trees, because the ash borer does prefer larger size trees. So in many cases, there are small sapling trees there in the understory. There are several insecticide treatments that you can use to protect individual trees from infestation. There's soil drench treatments that you can do. But for large trees, really all that you can do is a direct stem injection. And that really is costly. So that's really where treatments, in ornamental plantings or, a tree in the yard, those type of scenarios are where you would use that. Some other states are doing some work with like parasitoids, like parasitic wasp. So some biocontrol techniques. However, I don't think that's come far enough to say that that's a concrete answer for emerald ash borer yet. Um, so for trees that are in newly infested areas, so if you know that emerald ash borer has been confirmed, say 15 to 20 miles away, that's really when it's time to, think about doing some treatments, preventative treatments, such as those soil drench treatments or direct stem injections to protect those trees. Because once a tree gets compromised to the point where half the crown is dead, really the outlook for saving that tree is not very good.
Thank you. Well, unless anyone has any more questions, I'll give you a couple seconds to, um, let's see, to
Yeah,
ask. If
I'll
not,
go ahead and stop my share here.
okay. I did want to let everybody know too, before we wrap up, we have another webinar coming up in a few weeks on pond management. So I'll be sending out an email for registration and post that on our website and social media too. But I don't see any other questions as of now. So thank you so much, Drew. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you all for being here. And like I said, you'll receive an email with the recording either later today or tomorrow. So thank you all. I hope you all have a great rest of your day and see you next time.